So yeah, I guess in my keynote today, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about energy communities. I'll try to cover a couple of aspects of this topic. Um, Mainly, I will try to kind of give a little bit of a framing for any of you that are a little bit unaware of this, at least how it's framed in the legislation. Some of the interesting opportunities that energy communities provide any number of actors in the energy sector. And then I'll try to highlight some of the kind of key challenges that I see emerging right now with the development of not just regulations, but just general policy and legislation, because we are really at a sort of key juncture between paper to practice, and some of these processes are fairly nonlinear. So before I get into that, I'm going to do the little sales pitch for my organization and for Bridge, who I'm representing at this session. So for those of you that don't know who Rescoop EU is, we're basically a business association here in Brussels representing renewable energy cooperatives across around, I think it's now 15 member states, and the UK and Switzerland. And you can see the numbers who we represent. We represent a little more than 1 million citizens at the moment and around 1,900 renewable energy cooperatives. We, of course, participate in a number of coalitions and associations in Brussels, including the Bridge. On that, we don't really distinguish ourselves from other energy companies other than the fact that we operate by a set of different governance principles. So none of the activities we do are different. We just do them for a different reason and with a different mindset. And that comes back in the energy community concepts that the EU created in its clean energy package. Just a little bit about the working group for Bridge. So Bridge, I mean, most of you guys probably know it, but it's sort of this club that was created by the European Commission to try to collectivize and share all of this knowledge that's being gained from all of these research and development projects under Horizon. And the idea is really to just socialize all of the learning so that it doesn't go to die somewhere and so that it can be used by others. And within this, one of the Bridge working groups we have going on is on consumer engagement. And that has a number of different objectives, but overall, they're kind of really to understand how consumers work and what really gets them to engage in the energy system, and what sort of triggers can be used to target that effectively so that consumers can benefit and so that the energy system can benefit, and what are the regulatory drivers behind that. And my particular work concerns the collective aspect of that, really focusing on the energy community concept. So we have come to a couple of different decisions in the past year or so that have really sort of brought this concept to task and trying to really sort of get collective and existing knowledge from the different projects on collective actions. And we've been gathering those experiences over the last year, and in the next year we're trying to address different gaps and sort of bring forward the learning from those assessments so that the European can continue to make effective policy in this area. This is a little bit of our timeline. It's not that interesting, but we've set a specific number of tasks for ourselves. We've delivered a report to the European Commission, and we're holding a set of meetings on a consistent basis to try to continue to move that work forward. These are the different subgroups that you can see within the consumer working group. So there are a number of different aspects that we focus on. The particular group that I participate in is around governance. So we're looking at what are the best effective governance models for energy communities. So that is pretty interesting, and we should have some conclusions coming up from a year-long study that that colleagues of mine have been doing in that group. So, I mean, that's sort of the collecting the knowledge and everything. But now I'm going to bring us up a level to sort of the policy level. I'm going to expand a little bit. It's not just about energy communities. I think it's important to keep the context of what we were able to achieve in the clean energy package. And I sort of took this from the European Commission, but I think it's a good slide to sort of summarize how at least it sees the consumer empowerment agenda. One of the major, I would say, wins of the clean energy package was to break out of this traditional paradigm that a consumer is empowered if they understand how to read their energy bill. I mean, as a basic building block, this is of course of fundamental importance, but it's by no means the end of the story. It's only the beginning. And so the Commission in undertaking a sort of build out of its existing legislative acquis was, I mean, really around getting private capital, so increased investment from citizens, increasing local acceptance. This is a big problem in a lot of member states that have a lot of renewables already. And then this idea that we can tap into the resources of consumers to provide their flexibility, and that this can all be done through where we focus on, which is energy communities. And so what is an energy community? This has been a question we've been addressing for a couple of, well, I guess 4 or 5 years now. So, I mean, lots of people have their own understanding of what an energy community is. What it is in terms of the clean energy package is it's really an organizational or a social concept. It kind of starts with a legal entity, but when you peel the veil off of that legal entity, you see something that's a little bit different from your traditional commercial energy company. And that is that by and large, these entities are meant to provide social, environmental, and economic value for the members and for the local community. And that can mean a lot of different things, but that's one of the unique aspects of this, is that it really is a tool for local communities for social innovation, and the purposes to which they use that social innovation is determined by the community itself. And if you look at how those entities operate in terms of gathering people, including them, making sure that they are part of the decision-making process, and making sure that they have an ownership stake in that. This is important. It's also based on economic participation. It's not subordinated loans. It's not necessarily even crowdfunding, but it's actually taking a piece of that and being able to have a say about it. And it also emphasizes effective control by members that are not necessarily energy professionals. I mean, if we were just talking about new starters, we would simply be talking about regulations. But we're even getting more basic because we're talking about non-professionals being invited to play a part in the energy sector. And for renewable energy communities, it really is about the local aspect of that. So where does that kind of fit into the broader consumer empowerment agenda that the Commission undertook with the clean energy package? Here, I've tried to describe that, and with this graph, I've tried to get past some of the sort of misconceptions, because when energy communities came out, a lot of people saw buzzwords in those provisions around energy sharing and even collective self-consumption. But what I would say about energy communities is that they're not attached to any specific activity. They're attached to the organizational aspect of that activity and how it's undertaken. So you can see all of these definitions are new definitions that the Commission came up with. It started with active customers, which is basically the broadest notion of, as an individual consumer, you can become a participant in the energy market, with a subset of that being renewable self-consumers in the Renewables Directive. And then as a renewable self-consumer, you can participate individually, or you can participate jointly with others. That can be through any method. It could be through an energy community, but it could also be through a utility that happens to be able to set up these types of things, or project developer. And then the energy communities come in, and that is, I guess we would call it sort of the gold standard of collectivizing action, where you're really going the full mile to set up a legal entity and make it so that it operates for the collective good of everybody involved. Um, Again, this is just to sort of reemphasize all of the activities that are available to energy communities. It goes from everything from self-generation to sharing to traditional sort of supply, energy efficiency services, which are not necessarily tied to generation. And at least for renewable energy communities, it can focus on district heating and cooling. And in the electric sector, where member states allow, it's a little tricky of a topic, but general distribution as well. I won't get into the relationship between CECs and RECs because that's just going down a rabbit hole. Um, but I think it's also important to highlight, because I want to be fairly transparent. As Rescoop EU, we come at this from the perspective of collectivizing citizens and energy communities. But of course, the Commission provides benefits and opportunities for everybody to get involved, even for energy companies. There is a discretion for member states whether to let an existing energy company be a member of an energy community. But even when that is not possible, of course, there's the possibility to provide technology and services, because again, energy communities, we don't innovate technology necessarily. We take that technology and we use it for social innovative purposes. So we really do rely on technology and service providers, and those relationships are just going to grow over time. And as communities definitely need expert support from the sector. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And of course, that kind of brings me to the final segue in this intervention, which is how do we actually realize all of these opportunities to collaborate and to do the awesome things that we want to do. And that really gets us from getting from the clean energy package down into the national legislation, where everything needs to be translated. This is a very new legal concept, so it is going to be complicated, and it has been complicated. We released our own guidance. There are a number of guidance documents out there that try to provide member states with some good tips on how they can translate all of these things into national law. I mean, one of the things themselves, and I don't want to get too hung up on this, but all of these here you see are this is the definition. Essentially, these are the energy community definitions broken down into their requisite elements or criteria. Now, they're all principle based, which means the member states have the discretion to translate them in a fairly broad manner. Regardless of how they're translated, they still need to be translated, because whether you're a company or a group of citizens, you need to have legal clarity about what you need to do in order to set one of these up. And this has been incredibly difficult. And I'll highlight a trend here, and that's that a lot of member states, they're not necessarily sure how to translate these principles. So what they're doing is they're copying and pasting them, and then they will kick the can down the road and elaborate these further in bylaws, or even have the regulators take care of it. So there's going to be a lot of resources that are going to need to go into further specifying all of these, so that there is legal clarity at the national level. But even beyond this, and I have to say, I wish we could have been focusing on this more in the past couple of years, but that is really beyond what is an energy community. It's how are we actually going to get energy communities off the ground? And there's a couple aspects that I just want to highlight. First is that the member states are actually supposed to conduct an assessment on the potential of energy communities to look for what type of development they could have and what sort of barriers might be in place. Unfortunately, none of the member states have actually officially done this. So this is quite a disturbing trend, because we actually see this as an analytical basis for providing for looking at which regulations we need to focus on, what capacity building support energy communities need, how we want to look at ensuring that vulnerable or low income households can participate. there are a lot of issues that we need a little bit more of an analytical basis for, and that simply doesn't exist. But in principle, these assessments should result in the development of an enabling framework. And just for a little contextual side note, I'm mostly focusing on renewable energy communities in this discussion, because citizen energy communities are a little bit of a different animal. The policy behind it is to provide them a level playing field, which still might implicate some sort of simplification of regulation. But for renewable energy communities, the drive is really to ensure that they can grow and develop at the national level. So there's a stronger impetus for member states to make policies that drive this. And so for us, that's much more interesting. Obviously, we don't want energy communities focusing on gas. We want them, or fossil fuels, we want them to focus on renewables. So for us, renewable energy communities are really what's interesting. And then the final aspect of this relates to enabling frameworks, but it really gets at sort of, some people don't like it when I say this, but a philosophical understanding of where the market is headed. And I'm taking this quote. The Council for European Energy Regulators recently released a draft strategy for the Clean Energy Package implementation period. I believe it would start next year. And they've highlighted a number of trends in the energy sector and the fight against climate change. And one of the key pillars of this new strategy is about empowering consumers and local energy. And I like this quote: "The energy transition must provide consumers with necessary tools and a framework for them to participate in efforts to achieve a sustainable carbon neutral society." I fully agree with that. The question is, how do we do that? And I think as we look at that, what we are challenging is to actually rethink how we are regulating, because regulation has been entirely set up for a big centralized, large corporate structure, and it currently does not fit for the smaller, not just smaller actors, but the not necessarily professional actors. I think we all accept that you need to take on responsibility when you enter the energy sector, but again, not everybody is entering the market on a level playing field with the same knowledge and information. So we need to figure out how we're going to make the not just the rules for getting licensed, but the process for getting licensed and for getting projects up. We need to make it simple. We need to make it clear. And when it can't be made clear, we need to help consumers or energy communities make their way so that they can realize these projects, as long as they're willing to put the work in. So there's a number of aspects that this needs to focus on. A lot of it also has to do with the district, the network operators. There needs to be a lot more transparency, especially when we're looking at new and innovative projects around peer-to-peer or energy sharing, all of these localized projects. The DSOs are really sort of the gatekeepers for this, and they need to do their part to make sure that they have network plans so that certain projects are able to understand what might be expected of them before they even plan a project. And they need to have a clear line of communication with the DSO to understand what's possible. And I think moving forward, as you know, we're looking towards flexibility markets. That seems to be one of the new sexy terms in the industry. We really need to monitor how they are developing so that we aren't just creating another level of penetration that's fairly difficult for energy communities to enter into, because they do have a lot of flexibility that can be tapped. And I think a lot of the narrative has always been energy communities, they don't want to be part of the system. That's a false narrative. So, but we need to make sure that as we are developing the energy architecture for the future, that we keep this inclusion ideal in mind. We want to keep energy communities a part of the system. We need to give them a stake. So that's very important moving forward. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've captured a little bit about where this is heading and where some of the challenges are. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I look forward to hearing how some of these issues are being dealt with later on this morning. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Josh, for the presentation. It's very interesting, and I think it gives a nice overview of what Clean Energy Package is aiming at with some of the struggles that we're having along the way. We have a few questions in the chat, so I will just read them out to you, and then one by one, maybe. The first is from Sonia Klingert from University of Mannheim, our partner in the site project, and she asks about your opinion on the options of tenants to build a local energy community towards, for example, increasing PV collective self-consumption.
Yeah, I mean, I think tenants is it's a really tricky issue, um, because a lot of projects are happening on buildings that people already own. Um, but I think, I mean, it also depends. It depends because, you know, you have different landlords, right? Some people live in social housing and some people live in private rented housing. So I would say that if you're dealing with an individual or a private landowner, or a building owner, it's a little more complicated. But municipalities and local councils, they are often really good partners, and they even have an incentive to participate directly in these energy communities. So when it comes to those, there are a lot of really good examples of energy communities forming around social housing and working with the local authority to rent the buildings out and to do some socially innovative stuff. Brixton is a really good example. If you just look at Repowering London, I think I had a picture in the background that was on that. But also, I mean, if you're looking at energy sharing, it doesn't necessarily need to be on your building, and I think that is one of the interesting aspects of being able to create a project where the installation is not necessarily on your building, it's just on another one or on a piece of land, and you can share that energy with yourself, because then you're expanding the opportunities for people who don't just necessarily own their building. You can basically live anywhere as long as you're in the geographical scope of that community, and that can really open up a lot of options.
Okay, thank you. We have another 3 questions for now. One is from Agatha Smoke from Tinky. She asks, I wonder how much regulatory framework helps and how much it creates a barrier. To which extent could or should regulation influence citizen participation?
Mhm. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's both. It helps and it creates barriers. I think regulations have always created barriers. That's why you've always heard the energy sector or any sector talking about deregulation or simplifying regulation. And for energy communities, I think it's that sort of conversation, but on steroids. Um, because like I said earlier, regulations were made for big players. So one of the traditional sort of challenges that our members have faced, at least, is we want to do local supply. We want to do local supply. We don't want to supply the whole area of Germany or whatever. We just want to supply our little village with electricity. And they get told, well, you need to be balancing responsible across the entire market. So what are you going to do? So you know, that they have always been a barrier, and I think this is the real challenge. I mean, it may, and maybe it's a fantasy, maybe regulation is always going to stand in the way, um, but I mean, I think with any innovation, regulation must catch up, otherwise it stifles the innovation. So and I think whether people like it or not, again, I think a lot of national decision makers at this stage are, I don't want to sound harsh, but I want to say they're fairly incapable of creating the frameworks necessary. And I do think that's why they are sort of punting to the regulators. So whether we like it or not, regulators will play perhaps an outsized role in how a lot of energy community models function. So I think it's in our best interest to engage and think about how we can shape regulation so that it doesn't stand in the way of these types of projects.
I think the answer might be in the, let's say, going from the bottom up with some suggestions for regulation, or you know, being more local in regulating parts of the energy, or might be.
Yeah,
Well, we have discussion on this all day today, so.
yeah.
Okay, well, we have a question from Dorian Frieden from UNM Research from Austria. And he says, how do you understand the requirement that installations need to be owned by the community? We are currently having an exciting discussion on the question of how to actually define ownership. This strongly impacts actual business models and actors' roles, potentially allowing for leasing, contracting, etc.
Mhm. I think, yeah, Dorian, I think this is a really challenging issue to tackle, and I think it also, before I try to answer the question, I think it gets at one of the issues that we have in trying to crystallize any concept in legislation, and that's that you have to, at some point, you're going to exclude something. So, I mean, a lot of energy communities have been created through partnerships with commercial energy companies or developers, and this can be through bilateral contracts to co-own. But it can also mean that the commercial developer develops the project and then sells it or leases it to the community. I mean, I do think that there is room for flexibility there. A lot of communities don't have the capital to invest entirely in their projects, so they do rely on some sort of funding or loans. Um, for me, I think I would be comfortable if there was if there was a plan in place, and if it is a loan and they're paying it back, that they would sort of be able to meet that requirement, as long as they're moving in the direction that it's going to be fully owned at some point once they pay it back, with a proper business model in place. When it comes to leasing and contracting, I think there are probably some tough decisions to be made that doesn't necessarily satisfy everybody. Um, and I think the operative principle that we're looking for is control, and does that offer the actors who are using the project effective control over the project? And I guess that's more of a technical question. So it probably requires maybe some ad hoc implementation at first. It certainly deserves to be monitored so that it isn't sort of abused, but I would urge some flexibility there. So I'm kind of getting around the answer, but it's not an easy answer to give.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was going to ask you because you said at the beginning that Rescoop is there representing 1,900, if I saw correctly, cooperatives and communities. And what do you would you suggest some as, let's say, best practices, or give us some examples maybe that in this aspect would be a good answer
Mhm.
in the ownership point of view?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, our membership is not monolithic, so they do comprise a fairly broad set of different types of models, but there are certainly really good models. One of the ones I like to use is from Denmark.
Mhm.
And it's kind of a nice story of was it Evidazen? No, I can't remember the name right now. That's horrible. But it's a port town on the west coast of Denmark, and they actually had a commercial developer come, and he tried to develop a project, and the members of the community just were not having it. He actually got run out of town, but then the local businesses, because this is a fairly disused harbor, it was kind of getting old, and the businesses wanted to sort of renovate the harbor, so they created a foundation, all of the businesses there, and they got the local authority involved, and the foundation owns. They ended up constructing a couple of wind turbines outside, just on the coast, on the sand actually, and and that they are the primary owners, and then the revenues go to renovating the harbor, and they have a sort of governance system about where the revenues go. And then there's also co-ownership by a local citizens cooperative. Um, and I believe they have decided to sell it to the local district heating network, which is cooperatively owned by the local inhabitants there. So they're integrating it as storage, and playing around on the market with the excess resources that they have there. So I think I mean, that is like what I would say the gold standard is, but I would say a majority of projects are a little bit more in the middle where they are developing with a developer, where a developer comes in and says, I want to build 10 turbines, and the community says, well, okay, we want, we want 2 of those. So, and then those 2, they might be financed by the developer, they might be financed by the community itself. Ideally, it would be by the community itself. But there are various arrangements that those can take place. So,
and I mean, this could also be regulated that the community has to have a part in it, but
yeah, there are also ways to require this sort of thing.
We also have a question from Ludwig from consulting in Germany, and he says, oh, you can go ahead. I see you're there. You're muted, Ludwig.
No, Josh, what drives me, we are dealing with the most difficult pieces of the energy transition, the power. Power is very much regulated, and we tend to concentrate on energy communities dealing with power. And the situation in Germany is not that easy with regulation and legislation, but I come across a lot of attempts to build energy communities around heat and cooling and heat grids. Why is it that we do concentrate so much on power communities?
I think maybe I'm misspeaking. I think the answer is quite simple. It's that it requires a lot more capital investment to develop a district heating grid. I mean, that again, that's the oversimplistic answer. I do know, I mean, and you're probably aware with some as well, but in Germany, they started with a wind turbine, and then they actually used the revenues from the wind turbine to finance the district heating grid, which I think is really cool. I think it needs to be more, it needs to become a bigger focus, because it does impact a lot more. And but I also, it's a little bit, it's kind of difficult, because if you look at Denmark, you look at Germany, a lot of these grids are pre-existing from a very long time ago. Or especially in Denmark, the reason that they're such a shining example for district heating is because they've had a strategy in place at various times since the early 1900s. So it's the result of a century's worth of work. That's not to say that we shouldn't be focusing on it. It's like the perfect sweet spot for a local community. And this isn't like some model that barely exists. It exists throughout the world. So I think it does need more focus, for sure.
Well,
but maybe you have some other thoughts about why they don't do it.
Well,
we need to talk about that.
Sure. I would love to. Yeah.
Especially in Germany. Just one sentence. I mean, people in Germany tend to be rich, and they can afford to own their district heating. And we are doing a lot of consultancy to municipalities, and we get a lot of municipal support to develop such energy communities, whereas they are very much afraid of hitting the wall all the time and the ceiling all the time when they go for the energy communities in power. So maybe this would be a next step in countries that can afford to create energy communities around the heating systems.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think this is also probably a job for development, national development banks as well, because I think you have to look at of course, it's high upfront investment costs, but I mean, if they worked 100 years ago, they should work today in theory. So as long as you can provide the financing, the consumers should be, I think you can safely assume that if you set up a heating network, the consumer wants to pay their bill to make sure that it's properly financed. So yeah, there are ways around it, and maybe we also need to get back to some of the old thinking, not necessarily just the new.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Ludwig. I think this would have been, we could discuss on this for a long time. Definitely, it's an open question. I think communities in general, in most countries at this point, it's not yet defined how it's going to roll out. But I would like to continue with our discussion with the panel. Josh, I hope you stay around and join us also for discussion, as the panels today are foreseen to be very interactive. So we welcome all the questions from audience and also from you as well, if you if you want to join us at some point.